The Mind of God, Understanding George Berkeley and the Philosophy of Immaterialism. In this video, we'll break down one of the greatest Irish philosophers, from his radical claim that matter doesn't exist to his belief that to be is to be perceived, to understanding reality as ideas in the mind of God. This is George Berkeley. Born in 1685 in County Kilkenny, Ireland, into a family of English settlers, he would become known as one of the three great British empiricists, alongside John Locke and David Hume. But beneath this conventional classification lies one of the most radical and counterintuitive thinkers in Western philosophy. A man who dared to deny the existence of matter itself, who understood that what we call the physical world is nothing but ideas in minds, who saw that ordinary common sense contains profound philosophical confusion. Berkeley was born into relative comfort. His family, though not wealthy, had sufficient means to provide him with an excellent education. He attended Kilkenny College and then Trinity College, Dublin, where he would spend most of his early intellectual life. Unlike Heraclitus, who withdrew from society, Berkeley engaged actively with the intellectual and religious controversies of his time. He became a Fellow of Trinity College, took religious orders in the Church of Ireland, and eventually became Bishop of Cloyne. But his social engagement never dulled the radical edge of his philosophical thinking. Why did Berkeley make such extreme claims? Why deny the existence of matter when it seems so obviously real? Some critics accused him of sophistry, of defending an absurd position through clever arguments. But this misunderstands his entire project. Berkeley believed that the common-sense view of reality, the view that material objects exist independently of minds, leads to atheism, skepticism, and mathematical absurdities. His immaterialism was not a denial of reality, but a proper understanding of what reality actually is. His goal was not to shock or confuse, but to defend religion and common sense against what he saw as the dangerous abstractions of materialist philosophy. The world into which Berkeley was born was one of tremendous scientific and philosophical revolution. Newton had recently published his Principia Mathematica, providing a mathematical description of the physical universe. Locke had published his Essay Concerning Human Understanding, establishing empiricism as a major philosophical movement. The new science seemed to be replacing God with impersonal mechanical laws. Berkeley saw dangers in this development. If matter exists independently of mind, what role remains for God? If mathematical laws explain everything, what need for divine providence? If all our ideas come from physical objects, how can we know anything about spiritual reality? What makes Berkeley unique among philosophers is his willingness to embrace what seems like absurdity in order to reach deeper truth. Where other thinkers accepted the existence of matter as obvious and built their philosophies on this foundation, Berkeley questioned whether matter exists at all. Where others saw the physical world as independent of minds, he argued that physical objects are nothing but collections of ideas. Where others worried that denying matter leads to skepticism, he insisted that immaterialism provides the only secure foundation for knowledge. This was not perverse contradiction, but profound insight into the nature of reality. His philosophy speaks to us across 3 centuries because he addressed questions that remain urgently relevant. What is the relationship between mind and matter? How can consciousness arise from physical processes? What grounds the regularities we observe in nature? How can we reconcile scientific knowledge with religious faith? What is the nature of reality itself? These are not abstract academic questions, but fundamental challenges that shape how we understand ourselves and our place in the universe. Through his 3 major philosophical works, a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philinus, and numerous other writings, Berkeley created a philosophy that remains as challenging and provocative today as it was in the early 18th century. He saw reality as fundamentally mental. He understood physical objects as ideas in minds. He recognized that existence requires perception. His ideas remain as relevant today as they were 300 years ago, perhaps even more so in our age of virtual reality, digital existence, and fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness. Part 1. To be is to be perceived. The most famous principle associated with Berkeley is one he stated in Latin: esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived. This simple formula contains within it an entire worldview, a revolutionary understanding of what it means for anything to exist at all. To grasp what Berkeley meant requires us to think carefully about something we usually take for granted: the nature of existence and what we mean when we say something is real. When you look at a tree, what are you actually experiencing? Your immediate answer might be that you are seeing a physical object that exists outside your mind. The tree is there, solid and real, whether you look at it or not. But Berkeley invites you to examine your experience more carefully. What you actually perceive is not the tree itself, but colors, shapes, textures, smells, sounds. You see green and brown. You perceive a certain shape and size. You might smell the bark or hear leaves rustling. All of these are sensations, ideas in your mind. You never perceive the tree itself, only your ideas of the tree. Now Berkeley asks a challenging question. What reason do you have to believe that behind these ideas there exists a material tree that causes your perceptions? You cannot step outside your own mind to compare your ideas with material objects. All you ever have access to is your ideas. The supposed material tree is not something you perceive, but something you infer must exist to explain your perceptions. But this inference, Berkeley argues, is unjustified. Why multiply entities unnecessarily? Why assume that behind ideas there must be material things causing those ideas, when the ideas themselves are all we ever know? Consider your dreams. When you dream of a tree, that dream tree exists as an idea in your mind. It has all the sensory qualities of a perceived tree: color, shape, texture. Yet you do not think that dream trees are caused by material trees outside your mind. The dream tree exists entirely as an idea. Berkeley's radical claim is that waking perception is fundamentally the same as dreaming. The trees you see when awake are also ideas in your mind, not effects of material causes. This leads to Berkeley's central thesis: material substance does not exist. What we call physical objects are nothing but collections of ideas. The tree is not a material thing that causes your perceptions. The tree is your perceptions, your ideas of color and shape and texture and smell. Remove those perceptions, and nothing remains. The tree exists only insofar as it is perceived. When no one perceives the tree does not exist in the way we ordinarily think. But Berkeley immediately faces an obvious objection. If physical objects exist only when perceived, does that mean they pop in and out of existence depending on whether someone is looking? Does the tree cease to exist when I close my eyes or leave the room? This seems absurd. Common sense tells us that objects continue to exist unperceived. Berkeley's answer is one of the most important moves in his philosophy. Objects do continue to exist when no human perceives them because God perceives them. God's mind contains all ideas at all times. The tree exists when you are not looking at it because God is always looking at it. Physical objects are ideas in the mind of God, and we finite minds perceive some portion of God's ideas. This has profound implications for how we understand reality. The world is not made of dead, inert matter, existing independently of all minds. The world is made of ideas in minds, ultimately ideas in the infinite mind of God. Existence and perception are not separate but identical. To exist is to be perceived, and to be perceived is to exist as an idea in some mind. Material substance is not just unnecessary, it is meaningless. We cannot even form a coherent concept of matter as something that exists independently of all perception. Berkeley went further than simply denying matter's existence. He also argued that the very concept of material substance is confused and contradictory. What would matter be if it existed? Philosophers like Locke said, matter is the substratum that supports qualities. It is what has colour, shape, weight, and other properties. But Berkeley points out that we never perceive this substratum itself, only the qualities. The supposed material substance is entirely unknown and unknowable. It is a something we know not what, as Locke himself admitted. Why believe in such an unknowable entity? Moreover, how could material substance cause ideas in minds? Matter is supposed to be extended, solid, and inert. Minds are unextended, thinking, and active. How could something utterly unlike mind produce thoughts and perceptions in minds? The causal connection between matter and mind seems impossible to explain. But if we deny matter and say that ideas are caused by other minds, particularly by God's mind, then we have an intelligible explanation. Like causes like. Minds can affect other minds in ways that matter supposedly cannot. Understanding esse est percipi also reveals that Berkeley is not denying the reality of the world we experience. He is not saying that tables and trees and mountains do not exist. He is saying they exist differently than we usually think. They exist as ideas rather than as material substances. The world is perfectly real, but it is mental rather than material. This is not skepticism, but a positive account of what reality actually is. Consider the qualities we perceive: colours, sounds, tastes, smells, tactile sensations. Berkeley argues that these qualities exist only in the mind. A colour is not a property of material substance, but a sensation in a perceiver. Different creatures perceive different colours when looking at the same object. Is there one true colour the object really has? No, there are only the various colour sensations different perceivers have. The same applies to all sensory qualities. They exist as perceptions, not as properties of mind-independent matter. What about primary qualities like shape, size, and motion? Locke and other philosophers distinguish between primary qualities that really exist in objects and secondary qualities like colour that exist only in perceivers. But Berkeley rejects this distinction. Shape and size are just as relative and mind-dependent as colour. An object looks different sizes from different distances. It looks different shapes from different angles. Which is the real size and shape? There is no answer independent of perception. Primary and secondary qualities are equally mental, equally dependent on perceivers. This insight has profound implications for science. Newton's physics describes matter in motion according to mathematical laws. But if matter does not exist, what is physics describing? Berkeley's answer is that science describes the regular patterns in our perceptions, the reliable sequences of ideas that God produces in our minds. When we do physics, we are not discovering properties of mind-independent matter, but identifying the rules governing the ideas God presents to us. Science remains valid and useful, but it is about ideas and their relations, not about material substance. Part 2. The critique of abstract ideas. Berkeley's philosophy rests on a fundamental critique of abstraction. Most philosophers before him assumed that we can form abstract general ideas. We can think of triangularity in general, apart from any particular triangle. We can conceive of humanity in general, apart from any particular human. We can imagine extension in general, apart from any extended thing. Berkeley denies that such abstract ideas exist. This denial is crucial to his entire system because the concept of material substance depends on abstraction. What does it mean to abstract? Supposedly, we observe many particular triangles with different sizes, shapes, and angles. We then abstract the common feature of triangularity, forming a general idea that applies to all triangles but is not identical to any particular triangle. This abstract idea is neither equilateral, nor isosceles, nor scalene, neither large nor small, neither red nor blue, nor any particular color. It is pure triangularity stripped of all particular features. Berkeley argues that such abstraction is impossible. Try to imagine a triangle that is neither equilateral, nor isosceles, nor scalene. You cannot do it. Every triangle you imagine must have some particular shape. Try to imagine extension that has no particular size or shape. Impossible. Every extended thing you can imagine has some definite dimensions and configuration. The supposed abstract ideas are not ideas at all, but meaningless combinations of words. This applies directly to the concept of material substance. Philosophers say that matter is extended substance existing independently of minds. But extension always comes with particular size and shape. Substance is supposed to be something that supports qualities, but is not identical to any qualities. Try to form an idea of such a substance. You cannot. The idea of pure substance apart from any qualities is an impossible abstraction. Matter as philosophers conceive it is literally inconceivable. Berkeley illustrates this with vivid examples. Locke claimed we have a general abstract idea of a triangle that is neither oblique nor rectangle, neither equilateral, isosceles, nor scalene, but all and none of these at once. Berkeley points out that this is contradictory. How can something be both equilateral and not equilateral simultaneously? How can it have all angles and no particular angles? The supposed abstract idea is nonsense masquerading as philosophy. The critique of abstraction has profound implications. If we cannot form abstract ideas, then philosophy must deal with particular concrete ideas rather than general abstractions. We cannot talk about matter in general, but only about particular collections of perceived qualities. We cannot discuss substance in general, but only about particular things we perceive. This brings philosophy back to earth, grounding it in actual experience rather than impossible abstractions. Moreover, denying abstract ideas helps explain how language works. When we use general terms like tree or triangle, we are not referring to abstract ideas, but using particular ideas as representatives of all similar ideas. I might use my idea of a particular tree to represent all trees. The word tree does not stand for an abstract idea of treeness, but for any of the countless particular tree ideas we might have. Language functions through representative particular ideas, not through impossible abstractions. This also affects mathematics. Geometers talk about perfect circles and infinite lines. Berkeley does not deny that such talk is useful, but he insists that we do not thereby have ideas of perfect circles or infinite lines. We work with particular diagrams and use them to represent all similar figures. Mathematical reasoning is about relationships between ideas, not about properties of abstract objects. Mathematics remains valid, but its subject matter is mental, not material. The critique of abstraction is closely connected to Berkeley's empiricism. If all ideas come from experience, then we cannot have ideas that transcend possible experience. Abstract ideas supposedly combine features that cannot possibly coexist in any experience. Therefore, there are no abstract ideas. This is not a limitation of human cognition, but recognition that supposed abstract ideas are contradictory pseudo-concepts. Berkeley's nominalism follows from his critique of abstraction. General terms do not refer to abstract universals, but are names we apply to collections of particular things. There is no universal humanity existing apart from individual humans. There are only particular persons who resemble each other in certain respects. Language creates the illusion that universals exist, but careful analysis reveals only particulars and the mental habits through which we group them. This nominalism extends to mathematics and logic. Numbers are not abstract objects, but mental operations we perform on particular collections. When we say 2 plus 2 equals 4, we are describing relationships between particular ideas, not discovering truths about abstract entities. Mathematical necessity comes from the rules governing how we combine and compare ideas, not from properties of a Platonic realm of numbers. Yet Berkeley does not deny that we can make general statements or discover universal truths. We can say that all triangles have angles summing to 180 degrees. But this means that whenever we have ideas answering to the term triangle and perform the appropriate mental operations, we will arrive at this result. The universality is in the regular behavior of ideas, not in abstract objects existing independently of minds. The critique of abstraction also undermines materialism in another way. Materialists claim that matter exists unperceived. But what idea do we have of unperceived existence? We can only imagine things as perceived by ourselves or others. We cannot form an idea of something existing absolutely independent of all perception. The supposed idea of unperceived matter is another impossible abstraction, words without genuine meaning. Part 3. The Master Argument. Berkeley presents what has become known as the master argument against the existence of mind-independent matter. The argument is deceptively simple, but has generated centuries of debate. It runs as follows. Try to conceive of a tree existing unperceived, existing absolutely independent of any mind. You imagine a tree in a park with no one around. But in imagining this scene, you are perceiving it in your imagination. You cannot imagine something unperceived without thereby perceiving it. Therefore, you cannot form a coherent idea of unperceived existence. On first encounter, this argument seems like a cheap trick. Of course, when I imagine an unperceived tree, I must imagine it, and imagining is a form of perceiving. But that does not prove that the tree cannot exist unperceived. It only proves that I cannot think about it without perceiving it in thought. Berkeley seems to confuse what is true of our ideas with what is true of reality. But Berkeley's argument is more sophisticated than this objection suggests. He is not merely pointing out that imagination requires an imaginer. He is making a deeper point about the limits of conception. What we mean by existence must be grounded in possible experience. We cannot give meaning to terms by stipulating that they refer to things entirely beyond possible experience. When we try to imagine matter existing unperceived, we are not actually conceiving matter as utterly mind-independent. We are conceiving it as perceived by an imaginary observer or by ourselves in imagination. The master argument connects to Berkeley's empiricism. All ideas come from perception. We cannot have ideas of things that could never be perceived. The supposed idea of mind-independent matter is not an idea derived from experience, but a verbal formula we mistakenly think has meaning. When we examine what we actually conceive, when we use the term unperceived matter, we find we are conceiving ideas, things perceived, in imagination, not genuinely mind-independent existence. Consider what existence means. For anything to exist in a way we can understand, it must be possible for that thing to be perceived, known, experienced. Existence that could never, under any circumstances, be perceived is not existence at all, but an empty, verbal formula. This is not to say that things exist only when actually perceived by finite minds. God perceives all things always. But it is to say that existence necessarily involves perceivability, relation to possible perception. Berkeley anticipates the objection that he confuses ideas with their objects. When I imagine a tree, I have an idea of a tree, but the tree itself exists independently. Berkeley's response is to ask what the tree itself is, apart from the ideas we have of it. We say it is extended, solid, has certain shape and size. But all these are ideas, things we perceive. Strip away all perceived qualities, and nothing remains. The supposed tree itself is an abstraction, an impossible concept with no content. This connects to Berkeley's theological commitments. If physical objects are ideas in God's mind, then they exist independently of human minds, while still being essentially mental. The tree continues to exist when no human perceives it, because God perceives it. This preserves the independence and reality of the physical world, while denying that its existence is material, rather than mental. Objects are mind-independent in the sense of being independent of any particular finite mind, but mind-dependent in the sense that they exist only as ideas in some mind. The master argument also reveals the limits of skepticism. Skeptics worry that our perceptions might not match reality. But if reality is ideas, then our perceptions are reality, at least when they are vivid, coherent, and independent of our will. Skepticism arises from supposing a gap between ideas and things. Eliminate things and retain only ideas, and the gap disappears. We cannot be systematically mistaken about a reality we never perceive. We can only be mistaken about what our actual perceptions are. This does not mean we cannot have false beliefs. We can misremember, imagine what is not actual, or incorrectly predict what we will perceive. But error concerns relations among ideas, not failure of ideas to correspond to mind-independent matter. When I falsely believe there is a tree ahead, I am wrong, because the visual and tactile ideas I expect to have will not actually occur. Error is within the realm of ideas, not between ideas and some inaccessible material reality. The master argument has generated many responses. Some claim Berkeley confuses perceiving with existing. Others argue that we can conceive of unperceived existence by describing it even if we cannot imagine it. Still, others suggest that Berkeley's argument proves too much, implying that nothing can exist that we are not actually perceiving right now. But Berkeley's argument remains powerful. It challenges materialists to explain what they mean by mind-independent existence and how such existence could be known, is constituted by minds, or by what can be, is constituted by minds, or by what can be known. Berkeley is a realist about the physical world, in the sense that trees and mountains really exist. But he is an anti-realist about matter, in the sense that mind-independent material substance does not exist. This combination of positions makes his philosophy difficult to classify in standard terms. The master argument also anticipates phenomenological approaches to philosophy. If we begin with what is actually given in experience, rather than with theoretical postulates, we find ideas, appearances, phenomena. The supposed material substrata are theoretical additions, not experiential givens. Philosophy should stick to what can be experienced rather than inventing unverifiable theoretical entities. Berkeley's empiricism leads naturally to phenomenological method. Part 4. God and Continuous Existence. Berkeley's immaterialism faces an obvious challenge. If physical objects are ideas and ideas exist only when perceived, how do objects continue to exist when no human perceives them? Why does the world not flicker in and out of existence as people open and close their eyes? Berkeley's solution is central to his entire system. God perceives all things at all times, and therefore all things exist continuously in God's mind. This is not a desperate move to save a failing theory, but a natural consequence of Berkeley's principles. Ideas must exist in minds. Finite human minds cannot maintain the existence of all things. Therefore, there must be an infinite mind in which all ideas exist. The order and regularity of our perceptions demonstrates that these ideas are not products of our own minds, but are presented to us by God. The physical world is God's language, the systematic way in which God communicates with finite spirits. Consider what happens when you leave a room and return later to find everything as you left it. The furniture has not moved. The books are in the same positions. According to Berkeley, this is because God has been perceiving the room continuously while you were absent. God's ideas maintain the room's existence. When you return and perceive the room again, God coordinates your perceptions with his eternal perception, ensuring you perceive the same arrangement that has existed continuously in divine awareness. This solution preserves common sense while rejecting materialism. Objects really do continue to exist when unperceived by humans. They are not dependent on human consciousness. But their continuous existence is mental rather than material. They exist as ideas in God's mind, rather than as material substances existing independently of all minds. Berkeley claims his philosophy agrees with common sense more than materialism does, because ordinary people believe objects exist, and Berkeley agrees, while materialists introduce the dubious notion of matter existing beneath and beyond all possible perception. The divine perception solution also provides a foundation for natural law. Why do natural phenomena follow regular patterns? Why does fire always burn, water always flow downward, unsupported objects always fall? The materialist says these regularities arise from properties of matter and mechanical laws. But Berkeley argues that matter cannot explain anything because matter does not exist. The regularities in nature reflect the consistent way God chooses to produce ideas in finite minds. God does not create arbitrary chaos, but produces ideas according to stable patterns that we call laws of nature. These laws are not mechanical necessities, but divine choices. God freely establishes regular connections between ideas. Fire produces the idea of heat because God has chosen to associate these ideas systematically. We call this causation, but it is really regular sequence ordained by God. Natural law is divine grammar, the systematic rules God follows in speaking to us through sensory ideas. This has profound implications for natural science. When scientists discover laws of nature, they are discovering the patterns in God's ideas, the rules God follows in producing sensory ideas in our minds. Science does not reveal mechanical properties of matter, but identifies the divine grammar, the systematic way God communicates with us. This preserves the validity and usefulness of science while grounding it in divine will rather than material necessity. Berkeley's God is not the deist's remote clockmaker who creates the universe and then withdraws. God is continuously active, constantly producing ideas in finite minds, maintaining the existence of all things at every moment. Physical objects do not persist through their own material natures, but through continuous divine perception and will. The world depends absolutely on God at every instant. This is continuous creation, the doctrine that God not only created the world initially but constantly sustains it in existence. This conception of God's relationship to the world also addresses the problem of miracles. For materialists, miracles are violations of natural law, supernatural interventions into an otherwise mechanical system. But for Berkeley, so-called natural laws are just God's usual habits in producing ideas. A miracle is simply God choosing to produce ideas in an unusual pattern. There is no violation of mechanical necessity because there is no mechanical necessity. There is only God freely choosing different sequences of ideas than the usual patterns. The continuous divine perception also preserves human freedom. Our ideas divide into two categories: those we produce voluntarily through imagination and will, and those produced in us independently of our will by God. Ideas of sense, the perceptions that constitute the physical world, are God's doing, not ours. This is why we cannot simply will objects into existence or change their properties by wishing. But we can freely choose how to move our bodies and direct our attention, because these choices are our own acts, not imposed by God. Yet Berkeley faces a challenge regarding the privacy of thoughts. If God perceives all ideas, does this include our private thoughts and imaginations? Berkeley affirms that God knows all our ideas, even our most private thoughts. This might seem to eliminate privacy and make inner mental life transparent to divine inspection. But Berkeley accepts this implication. God is omniscient and knows all minds completely. Privacy is only relative, concerning what other finite minds can perceive, not absolute in the sense of being hidden even from God. The divine perception solution also connects to ethics. If God perceives all our actions and thoughts, then we are always under divine observation. We cannot hide our wrongdoing or escape divine judgment. This provides a foundation for morality grounded in God's nature and will. Moral laws are not arbitrary divine commands, but reflect God's perfect goodness and wisdom. By understanding the regularities God has established, we can infer something of divine purposes and thereby discover moral principles. Part 5. Spirits and Personal Identity. Berkeley's metaphysics contains two fundamental kinds of existence: ideas and spirits. Ideas are passive, inert objects of perception. Spirits are active, thinking, willing beings that perceive ideas and cause changes in ideas through volition. This dualism of idea and spirit replaces the traditional dualism of mind and matter. For Berkeley, minds and ideas are the only existences. Matter is eliminated as unnecessary and meaningless. What is a spirit? A spirit is an active being that thinks, wills, and perceives. You know your own spirit directly through self-awareness. You are immediately conscious of yourself as a thinking, willing subject, not as an object perceived by the senses. This direct awareness of spirit is fundamentally different from perception of ideas. Ideas are objects present to consciousness. Spirit is the consciousness itself, the subject that perceives objects but is never itself perceived as an object. This creates an apparent problem. Berkeley says all existence is perception, but spirits are not perceived. How then can we know they exist? Berkeley's answer is that we have notions of spirits rather than ideas. Ideas are passive objects of sense. Notions are different kinds of awareness, immediate consciousness of active subjects. We have a notion of ourselves through self-awareness, and notions of other spirits through analogy and inference from their effects. The distinction between ideas and notions is crucial to Berkeley's system. It prevents the collapse of all existence into ideas and preserves the fundamental distinction between subject and object, between perceiver and perceived. Ideas exist only as objects for spirits. Spirits exist as subjects that have ideas. The two categories are mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive of all existence. Everything that exists is either an idea in a mind or a mind having ideas. How do we know other spirits exist? We cannot perceive them directly because spirits are not objects of sense. But we can infer their existence from their effects. When I observe a human body moving in coordinated, purposeful ways, producing language and responding to circumstances intelligently, I infer that a spirit exists associated with that body. The body itself is only a collection of ideas, but the patterns in those ideas indicate an active spirit causing them. This also applies to God. We cannot perceive God directly, but we can infer divine existence from the order and regularity of sensory ideas. These ideas are independent of our will, appear in systematic patterns, and exhibit design and purpose far beyond human capacities. The best explanation is an infinite spirit that produces these ideas according to wise and benevolent purposes. The existence of God is not a matter of faith alone, but a rational inference from the character of experience. Personal identity creates challenges for Berkeley. If I am not a material body, what makes me the same person over time? My ideas constantly change. Memories fade and are replaced. Thoughts come and go. What constitutes my continuing identity? Berkeley's answer is that the spirit itself persists, even as its ideas change. I am not my ideas, but the spirit that has ideas. The subject of experience continues even as the objects of experience transform. But this raises further questions. What is the principle of continuity for spirits? How do we know the spirit persists, rather than being constantly recreated? Berkeley appeals to immediate self-awareness. I am directly conscious of myself as a continuing subject of experiences, not as a series of disconnected mental states. This self-awareness provides certainty of my own persistence that does not depend on inference or empirical evidence. The relationship between spirits and ideas is asymmetric. Ideas depend absolutely on spirits for their existence. An idea cannot exist without being perceived by some spirit. But spirits do not depend on ideas in the same way. A spirit could exist without perceiving any particular idea, though it could not be a perceiving spirit without perceiving something. God exists eternally and necessarily, while ideas exist only insofar as God wills them. Finite spirits exist as created by God, and could in principle exist without any sensory ideas, though in practice God continuously presents sensory ideas to created spirits. This framework has implications for life after death. The body is only a collection of ideas and does not constitute the essential self. The spirit is the true person and could survive the dissolution of the body. Berkeley affirms immortality based on the nature of spirits as simple, indivisible substances that cannot be destroyed through division or dissolution. Material things decompose because they are collections of parts, but spirits are simple and therefore not subject to corruption. The relationship between spirits also requires explanation. How do finite spirits interact with each other and with God? Berkeley denies direct causal interaction between finite spirits. My will cannot directly affect your ideas or vice versa. Instead, all causal relations between spirits are mediated through God. When I speak to you, my will causes motions in the ideas constituting my body. God perceives these motions and produces corresponding sensory ideas in your mind. Communication is not direct, but mediated through the divine mind that coordinates the perceptions of all finite spirits. This occasionalist picture preserves God's role as the only genuine cause, while allowing for practical language about finite spirits causing effects. When we say fire causes heat, we mean God regularly produces the idea of heat when conditions associated with fire are present. When we say one person's actions affect another, we mean God coordinates ideas in different minds, according to regular patterns. Apparent causal relations are really occasions for divine action, not mechanical necessities or direct influences. Part 6. Against skepticism. One of Berkeley's central aims was to refute skepticism. He believed that materialism inevitably leads to skeptical doubts about whether our perceptions correspond to reality. If physical objects are material substances existing independently of perception, how can we know our ideas resemble these objects? We can never compare ideas with objects because we only have access to ideas. This generates insoluble, skeptical worries. But Berkeley claims that immaterialism eliminates the gap between ideas and objects, thereby eliminating grounds for skepticism. Consider the skeptical scenario that Descartes made famous. How do you know you are not dreaming right now? How do you know an evil demon is not deceiving you, producing false ideas that do not correspond to reality? These scenarios work by exploiting the supposed gap between ideas and external material objects. If objects are independent of ideas, then ideas might fail to correspond to objects. But Berkeley argues there is no such gap. Physical objects are ideas. Therefore, vivid sensory ideas are reality itself, not representations of something beyond. When I perceive a tree, I am not perceiving a representation of a material tree. I am perceiving the tree itself, which exists as a collection of ideas in God's mind and is made present to my mind through divine action. There is no question of whether my idea corresponds to the tree because my idea is my perception of the tree. The tree I perceive is the real tree, not a mental image of something I cannot access. Skepticism about correspondence between ideas and objects dissolves when we recognize that objects are ideas. Berkeley distinguishes between real things and imaginary things, but this distinction does not rest on the supposed difference between ideas and material substances. Real things are ideas that are vivid, coherent, systematic, and independent of our will. Imaginary things are faint ideas we produce voluntarily in imagination. Real things follow regular patterns and appear whether we wish them to or not. Imaginary things obey our will and lack the forcefulness and stability of real perceptions. This distinction is within the realm of ideas, not between ideas and non-ideas. The difference between waking and dreaming is also explained without appealing to matter. Waking perceptions are more vivid, more coherent, more systematic than dream perceptions. Dreams are confused, unstable, disconnected. Waking experience exhibits rational connections and follows discoverable laws. Dreams do not. This experiential difference marks the distinction between dream and reality, not correspondence to mind-independent matter versus failure to correspond. Berkeley also addresses skepticism about other minds. How do we know other people exist and are not mere automatons? The materialist faces a serious problem here because other minds cannot be perceived if they are immaterial substances. But Berkeley argues that we infer other minds from observable behavior in the same way we infer God from the order of nature. When I observe a body exhibiting intelligent, purposeful behavior, producing meaningful language and responding appropriately to circumstances, the best explanation is another spirit associated with that body. This inference is not demonstratively certain, but it is reasonable and reliable. We cannot prove with absolute certainty that other minds exist, but we have strong inductive grounds for believing they do. The behavior of other human bodies is best explained by supposing spirits that perceive and will, not by supposing mere mechanical processes. This applies equally whether we accept matter or reject it. The inference to other minds depends on observed behavior, not on materialist metaphysics. Skepticism about the external world also dissolves under Berkeley's system. Skeptics worry that we might be locked inside our own minds with no access to external reality. But for Berkeley, sensory ideas are external to our will and control. They force themselves upon us whether we wish them to or not. This externality is what matters for distinguishing subjective imagination from objective reality. The distinction between internal and external is not between mental and material, but between voluntary and involuntary ideas. Moreover, Berkeley argues that materialism actually generates skepticism rather than answering it. If material objects exist independently of minds, how can minds know them? All we ever have access to is ideas. We can never step outside our ideas to see whether they correspond to material objects. The supposed material world becomes unknowable in principle. But immaterialism avoids this problem by identifying the physical world with ideas. We know the physical world because the physical world is what we perceive. The problem of error remains. How do we explain false beliefs if reality is ideas, and we perceive reality directly? Berkeley's answer is that error concerns expectations and predictions, not immediate perception. When I falsely believe there is water ahead in the desert, I am mistaken because the visual ideas I currently have do not reliably predict the tactile ideas I would have if I approached. Error is failure of prediction within the realm of ideas, not failure of ideas to correspond to matter. Scientific knowledge is also secured rather than threatened by immaterialism. Science discovers patterns in our perceptions, regular connections between ideas that allow prediction and control. These patterns are real and objective because they reflect God's consistent ways of producing ideas. Scientific laws are not human inventions, but discoveries about divine grammar, the systematic rules God follows in coordinating our experiences. Rejecting matter does not undermine science, but provides a more secure foundation than materialism can offer. Berkeley's anti-skeptical strategy is radical. Instead of trying to prove that our ideas correspond to mind-independent objects, he eliminates mind-independent objects altogether. Instead of attempting to show that the external world matches our perceptions, he identifies the external world with our perceptions. This move seems to increase skeptical risk by making everything mental, but Berkeley argues it actually eliminates skeptical possibilities by closing the gap between appearance and reality. Part 7. The New Theory of Vision. Berkeley's first major work, An Essay Towards a New Theory of Vision, presents a revolutionary account of visual perception. He argues that sight alone cannot give us ideas of distance, magnitude, or three-dimensional space. What we immediately see is only light and colors. Ideas of distance and three-dimensional extension come from combining visual ideas with tactile ideas learned through experience. This anticipates his later immaterialism by showing that even basic spatial perception involves mental construction rather than passive reception of material reality. Consider how we perceive distance. When you look at a tree 20 feet away, what visual sensation indicates that specific distance? Berkeley argues that distance itself is not visible. What you see is a certain appearance of the tree, a certain size and clarity of visual image. From experience, you have learned to associate this visual appearance with the distance you would traverse by walking and the tactile sensations you would have when touching the tree. The idea of distance is not given in sight, but inferred from sight, based on learned correlations with touch and movement. This explains why someone born blind who gains sight cannot immediately judge distances visually. Such a person would see colors and lights, but would not know how far away things are until learning to correlate visual appearances with tactile and motor experiences. The famous Molyneux problem asks whether someone born blind who learns to distinguish a cube and sphere by touch could distinguish them by sight if suddenly able to see. Berkeley's answer is no, because visual and tactile ideas are completely different and must be associated through experience. The same applies to size. We think we see how large things are, but Berkeley argues that visible size is merely the extent of the visual field occupied by an object's appearance. Real size, the magnitude we care about, involves how much space an object takes up in 3 dimensions and how it would feel to the touch. This real size is not visible but inferred from visual cues based on experience. A distant mountain might occupy a small visual angle, but we judge it large because we have learned to associate certain visual appearances with great tactile magnitude. Berkeley distinguishes between the visible world and the tangible world. The visible world consists only of light and colors spread across our visual field. The tangible world consists of three-dimensional objects we can touch and move through. These are different ideas that we habitually associate. A visible square and a tangible square are not the same idea, but different ideas we have learned to connect. Vision does not give us direct access to three-dimensional space, but only to two-dimensional colors and lights that we interpret based on tactile learning. Part 8. The Language of God. Berkeley develops a remarkable conception of the physical world as a divine language. The regular patterns in our sensory experience constitute a systematic means of communication from God to finite spirits. Learning to understand natural laws is like learning to read God's language. Fire signifying heat, dark clouds signifying rain, certain visual appearances signifying distance. These are grammatical rules in the divine language through which God informs us about what ideas to expect. This metaphor is not mere poetic flourishing, but captures something essential about Berkeley's system. Languages work through conventional associations between signs and things signified. The word tree is connected to our ideas of trees through linguistic convention, not natural necessity. Similarly, the connection between fire and heat, between visual appearances and tactile sensations, between causes and effects, are divine conventions, patterns God has chosen to follow in producing ideas in our minds. Just as we must learn human languages through experience and practice, we must learn the language of nature through observing regularities and forming expectations. A child learns that touching fire produces pain, that certain sounds mean food is coming, that nighttime follows daytime. These are grammatical lessons in God's language, learning the systematic ways God coordinates our sensory ideas. Natural science is advanced language learning, discovering subtle and complex grammatical rules that govern natural phenomena. This conception preserves the objectivity of natural law while denying material necessity. The laws of nature are real patterns in how God produces ideas, but they are not mechanical necessities imposed by material properties. They are free divine choices that God could have made differently, but has chosen to maintain consistently. God could change the rules of the language but chooses not to, preserving the stable grammar. That makes natural science possible and practical life manageable. The language metaphor also explains divine purposes in creating the natural order. Why does God produce sensory ideas according to regular patterns rather than arbitrarily? Because systematic patterns allow finite spirits to predict future experiences and act effectively. If natural events were random, we could not plan or learn from experience. The regularity of nature is God's gift, enabling us to function as rational agents who can understand our environment and make informed choices. This also provides a foundation for ethics. Some patterns in experience relate to our welfare and flourishing. Pain signals bodily damage. Hunger signals need for food. Certain actions regularly produce beneficial consequences, while others produce harm. These patterns are God's way of teaching us how to live well. Natural law, in the moral sense, connects to natural law in the descriptive sense. Both are aspects of divine communication, God's systematic way of guiding created spirits toward their good. The language metaphor transforms how we understand causation. On materialist accounts, causes necessitate their effects through mechanical properties of matter. But Berkeley argues that what we call causation is really regular sequence. Fire does not necessitate heat through material properties. Rather, God has established that the idea of fire shall regularly be followed by the idea of heat. The connection is linguistic, a grammatical rule in God's language, not a mechanical necessity. This has implications for miracles. In human language, we can use words in unusual ways for special purposes. A poet might violate grammatical rules to create effects. Similarly, God can deviate from the usual patterns of nature for special purposes. A miracle is God using the natural language in an unusual way, not violating mechanical laws, but choosing to produce ideas in sequences that differ from the established grammar. This makes miracles possible without requiring breaks in natural necessity. Since there is no natural necessity, only divine linguistic conventions. The language of nature is also perfectly suited to our needs and capacities. God could have established any number of different patterns, any number of different languages. But the actual patterns God has chosen are ones we can learn through experience and reason about effectively. The grammar is complex enough to be interesting and rich, but simple enough to be learnable. This shows divine wisdom and benevolence in creating a world we can understand and navigate successfully. Berkeley also emphasizes that natural language, like human language, admits of degrees of understanding. A child knows that fire hurts. An adult knows more complex patterns about combustion and heat transfer. A scientist knows mathematical laws governing thermodynamics. All are reading the same divine language, but with different levels of sophistication. Progress in natural science is advancement in linguistic competence, learning to read God's grammar with increasing precision and scope. The universality of natural law reflects the fact that God speaks the same language to all finite minds. Every spirit receives ideas according to the same grammatical rules. This is why natural science is possible and why different people can communicate about shared experiences. We all inhabit the same linguistic space, receiving messages in the same divine language. The objectivity of science rests on God's consistency in using the same grammar with all created spirits. This conception also makes prayer and divine providence compatible with natural law. When we pray for rain or healing, we are not asking God to violate natural patterns, but requesting that God produce ideas conducive to our welfare. God may grant such requests while maintaining general regularity in the natural language. Just as a speaker can say different things while respecting grammatical rules, God can produce different specific sequences of ideas while maintaining overall systematic pattern. Part 9. The Defense of Common Sense. Berkeley insists that his philosophy supports common sense against the abstractions of materialist philosophy. Ordinary people believe that tables and trees and mountains really exist and continue existing when unperceived. Berkeley agrees. Materialist philosophers say that these familiar objects are really composed of imperceptible material particles with only mathematical properties. Berkeley argues this contradicts common sense by replacing familiar objects with theoretical abstractions. What does common sense say about physical objects? That they exist, that they have sensible qualities like color and texture, that they persist over time, that they are independent of any particular human mind. Berkeley affirms all of these. Objects exist as ideas in God's mind. They have all the sensible qualities we perceive in them, because these qualities are their entire nature. They persist continuously because God perceives them continuously. They are independent of human minds because they exist in divine mind whether we perceive them or not. Materialism, by contrast, denies the testimony of the senses. It says that objects do not really have the colors, tastes, sounds, and feels we experience. These qualities exist only in our minds. The real objects are colorless, tasteless, silent arrangements of particles. This contradicts what the senses tell us. Berkeley preserves the evidence of sense by identifying objects with their sensible qualities, rather than positing unperceivable material substrata beneath them. Common sense also says we perceive real things, not merely representations of things. When I look at a tree, I see the tree itself, not an idea that represents a tree. Berkeley agrees completely. The tree I see is the real tree, existing as ideas in God's mind and made present to my mind through divine action. Materialism, by making objects independent of ideas, creates a gap between perception and reality. We perceive only ideas while real objects remain forever hidden behind the veil of perception. This contradicts the common sense conviction that we perceive reality directly. The independence of objects from human perception is also preserved. When I leave the room, the furniture does not cease to exist or pop back into existence when I return. Berkeley explains this through continuous divine perception. Materialists explain it through matter existing independently of all minds. But common sense does not assert that objects exist independently of all minds, only that they exist independently of human minds. Berkeley's explanation respects this common sense intuition while avoiding the philosophical problems of materialism. Berkeley also defends common sense regarding causation and natural law. Ordinary people believe that fire causes heat, that the sun causes daylight, that rain makes plants grow. Berkeley does not deny these causal claims. He reinterprets them. Fire causes heat means that God reliably produces the idea of heat when conditions associated with fire are present. This preserves the practical content of causal claims while avoiding materialist metaphysics. The patterns we rely on in daily life remain intact under immaterialism. The reality of the physical world is also preserved. Materialists sometimes suggest that if matter does not exist, the physical world is illusory. But Berkeley argues that his system makes the physical world perfectly real. Tables and trees exist. They have definite properties. They obey regular laws. They are independent of human minds. They provide resistance to our actions. All of this is real, not illusory. The only thing rejected is the philosophical fiction of material substance, which adds nothing to our experience and creates insoluble problems. Common sense distinguishes between real perceptions and imaginary ideas. Berkeley preserves this distinction through the criterion of independence from will. Real perceptions force themselves upon us whether we wish them or not. They appear in systematic patterns beyond our control. Imaginary ideas obey our will and lack the coherence and forcefulness of sense perceptions. This experiential difference is all we mean by the distinction between real and imaginary, and it survives intact under immaterialism. The permanence of objects is also secured. Common sense says that the tree in the yard is the same tree from one year to the next. Berkeley agrees. The collection of ideas constituting the tree persists continuously in God's mind. The patterns of ideas remain stable over time. The tree we perceive now is numerically identical to the tree we perceived before, because it is the same set of divine ideas made present to our minds at different times. Personal identity for physical objects is grounded in divine perception, just as personal identity for spirits is grounded in the persistence of the subject of experience. Berkeley argues that philosophers have corrupted common sense by introducing material substance. Ordinary people do not believe in imperceptible substrata underlying sensible qualities. They believe in tables and trees, things they can see and touch. Materialist philosophy replaces these familiar objects with theoretical entities bearing little resemblance to what we actually experience. Berkeley's immaterialism is a return to genuine common sense, rejecting philosophical abstractions in favor of experienced reality. The practical consequences of Berkeley's philosophy are minimal. We still avoid fire to prevent pain. We still eat to satisfy hunger. We still trust our senses in navigating the world. Natural science continues discovering patterns in experience. Technology continues manipulating ideas to achieve desired effects. Nothing in daily life or scientific practice changes. The only change is metaphysical understanding of what these familiar things actually are. This shows that Berkeley's philosophy refines rather than contradicts common sense. Part 10. Mathematics and Infinity. Berkeley's philosophy of mathematics is closely connected to his critique of abstraction and his rejection of matter. He denies that mathematical objects exist as abstract entities or properties of material substance. Numbers, geometric figures, and mathematical relationships are ideas in minds or relations between ideas. Mathematics studies these ideas and their relations, not a Platonic realm of abstract objects or properties of mind-independent matter. Consider numbers. What is the number 3? Berkeley denies that 3 exists as an abstract object or universal property. There are only particular collections of 3 ideas. The number 3 is how we think about certain collections, a mental operation we perform, not an independently existing entity. We learn to count by associating numerals with collections of perceived ideas. Mathematical truth concerns relationships between our ideas when we perform these mental operations correctly. This nominalist approach to mathematics faces the challenge of explaining mathematical necessity. Why must 2 + 2 = 4? Berkeley's answer is that this necessity arises from the definitions of terms and the rules governing mathematical operations. Given what we mean by 2 and 4 and plus, it follows necessarily that 2 + 2 = 4. The necessity is conceptual rather than arising from properties of abstract objects. It reflects how our mathematical concepts relate, not discoveries about independent mathematical reality. Geometry presents special challenges. Geometers prove theorems about perfect circles and infinite lines. Berkeley does not deny the validity of geometric reasoning, but he insists that we do not thereby have ideas of perfect circles or infinite lines. We work with particular diagrams and use them to represent all similar figures. Geometric reasoning is about relationships that hold for any figures of certain types, not about perfect abstract forms, existing in a Platonic heaven, or about properties of material space. Berkeley is particularly critical of the infinitesimal calculus developed by Newton and Leibniz. The calculus seemed to involve reasoning about infinitely small quantities, ghosts of departed quantities, as Berkeley mockingly called them. He argued that the concept of infinitesimal is incoherent. An infinitesimal would have to be both greater than 0 and less than any finite quantity. But there is no such quantity. The calculus works despite this conceptual confusion, Berkeley claimed, because mathematicians unconsciously use compensation of errors, mistakes cancelling out to yield correct results. This criticism of infinitesimals was prescient. Later developments in mathematics vindicated Berkeley's concerns by providing rigorous foundations for calculus that avoid infinitesimals. Modern approaches use limits rather than infinitely small quantities. This shows that Berkeley was right to question the conceptual foundations of calculus, even though the mathematical techniques were practically useful. Berkeley also criticizes the notion of absolute space and time. Newton claimed that space and time exist absolutely, independently of any objects or events within them. But Berkeley argues that we have no idea of space apart from extended objects or of time apart from sequences of ideas. Space is the ordering of coexistent ideas. Time is the ordering of successive ideas. Neither exists as an absolute container independent of what it contains. This anticipates relationist theories of space and time in which spatial and temporal relations are fundamental rather than space and time themselves. The concept of infinity creates further problems. Berkeley denies that we can have ideas of infinite quantities. Every idea we actually have is finite and particular. The supposed idea of infinity is really the idea of indefinite increasability. We can always imagine adding more units to any collection or extending any line further. But this endless possibility of increase is not the same as actual infinity. Mathematical language about infinity is shorthand for claims about what holds for arbitrarily large finite quantities, not reference to genuinely infinite objects. This has implications for theology. How can finite minds know an infinite God? Berkeley's answer is that we have a notion of God, not an idea. We know God as the infinite spirit that produces our sensory ideas and sustains all existence. But we do not comprehend God's infinity in the sense of having an adequate idea of it. Our knowledge of God is real but limited, reflecting our finite nature and God's accommodation to our capacities. Berkeley's philosophy of mathematics preserves the certainty and usefulness of mathematical knowledge while denying that mathematics requires abstract objects or material substrata. Mathematical truth is about relations between ideas and operations we perform on ideas. This makes mathematics perfectly objective because ideas and their relations are objective facts, even though they are mental rather than material. Mathematics does not need matter to have a subject matter, because ideas provide a perfectly adequate domain for mathematical reasoning. The application of mathematics to nature is also explained. When we use mathematics to describe natural phenomena, we are identifying quantitative patterns in our sensory ideas. These patterns are real and objective because they reflect the systematic ways God produces ideas. Mathematical physics discovers mathematical structures in the divine language, not mathematical properties of material substance. This preserves the validity of mathematical science while avoiding materialist metaphysics. Berkeley's criticisms of contemporary mathematics were not always well received. Many mathematicians ignored his objections and continued using methods that worked practically even if conceptually problematic. But Berkeley raised important questions about foundations that later mathematicians took seriously. The development of rigorous analysis in the 19th century addressed many of Berkeley's concerns about infinity and infinitesimals, even though it did not adopt his idealist metaphysics. Part 11. Ethics and Practical Life. Berkeley's ethics emerges naturally from his metaphysical and theological commitments. If reality consists of ideas in minds, and if God produces our sensory ideas according to wise and benevolent purposes, then ethics involves discerning divine purposes and living in accordance with them. Moral laws are not arbitrary divine commands, but reflect God's nature and the structure of reality God has created. Understanding how God has ordered our experiences reveals principles for living well. The foundation of ethics is the recognition that we are spirits created by God for certain purposes. Our nature as thinking, willing beings determines what constitutes our flourishing. We are not self-sufficient but depend continuously on God, who sustains our existence and provides our sensory ideas. This dependence should generate gratitude, humility, and desire to live according to divine purposes, rather than purely selfish aims. God has established regular connections between certain actions and beneficial or harmful consequences. These patterns provide natural moral guidance. Actions that regularly produce beneficial consequences are good. Actions that regularly produce harmful consequences are bad. This is not arbitrary, but reflects how God has ordered reality to guide us toward our good. Discovering moral truth involves observing these patterns and reasoning about what conduces to genuine human flourishing. Berkeley rejects pure ethical egoism. While self-interest is legitimate, we are created for community with other spirits. God produces ideas in all finite minds and cares for all created spirits. Therefore, we should care for others' welfare as well as our own. The systematic way God coordinates experiences across different minds shows that we are meant to live cooperatively rather than purely competitively. Morality requires considering effects of our actions on other spirits, not merely on ourselves. The reality of free will is central to Berkeley's ethics. We are not mere passive recipients of ideas, but active spirits who choose how to respond to circumstances. Our volitions are genuinely our own, not determined by prior material causes. This freedom makes us morally responsible for our choices and actions. We can be praised or blamed because we could have chosen differently. Without free will, moral responsibility would be impossible. But Berkeley also recognizes divine providence. God knows all our choices and has ordered the world to bring about good purposes overall. This does not eliminate human freedom because God's knowledge is not causally determinative. God knows what we will freely choose, but does not thereby cause our choices. Divine providence and human freedom are compatible because God's governance works through our free actions, rather than by overriding them. Virtue involves aligning our will with God's will. Since God is perfectly wise and good, divine purposes are always right. By understanding what God intends for us and choosing to cooperate with those intentions, we act virtuously. This is not mere obedience to arbitrary commands, but rational recognition of and cooperation with objective goodness embodied in divine nature and purposes. The virtuous person loves God and desires to participate in divine purposes. Berkeley also emphasizes the social dimensions of ethics. We are created for community and depend on each other for survival and flourishing. God coordinates our experiences to make cooperation possible and beneficial. Therefore, justice, honesty, kindness, and other social virtues are not mere conventions, but reflect the fundamental structure of reality. Living virtuously means living in ways that acknowledge our essential sociality and interdependence. The afterlife provides additional moral motivation. Berkeley believes in personal immortality based on the nature of spirits as simple substances that cannot be destroyed through dissolution. Death dissolves the body, which is only a collection of ideas, but the spirit continues existing. In the afterlife, God may produce different sensory ideas than in this life, or may allow spirits to exist without bodily ideas. Either way, moral choices in this life have eternal consequences, because spirits persist beyond death. Happiness in Berkeley's ethics involves proper relationship with God and with other spirits. It is not merely sensory pleasure, but includes knowledge, virtue, and harmonious relationships. God produces sensory ideas conducive to our welfare when we live according to divine purposes. Suffering often results from our own bad choices, or is necessary for our development and learning. The wise person seeks genuine happiness through virtue and divine friendship, rather than mere fleeting pleasures. Berkeley's ethics is neither purely consequentialist nor purely deontological. Actions are good because they are right and because they produce good consequences, and these two criteria ultimately coincide because God has ordered reality so that right actions produce beneficial results. The distinction between these ethical theories is less sharp in Berkeley's framework because divine purposes unite rightness and goodness in a systematic whole. Part 12. The Problem of Evil. Berkeley's theistic immaterialism faces the classic problem of evil in particularly acute form. If God produces all our sensory ideas, and if God is perfectly good and all-powerful, why do we experience pain, suffering, and evil? Berkeley cannot appeal to matter as a source of evil independent of God. On his view, God directly causes all our sensory experiences, including experiences of pain and hardship. How can this be reconciled with divine goodness? Berkeley offers several responses. First, much suffering results from human free will. God creates spirits with genuine freedom to choose good or evil. When people choose evil, they cause suffering for themselves and others. God permits this because genuine freedom requires real possibility of wrong choice. A world of automatons programmed to be good would lack the moral value that comes from free creatures choosing virtue. The evils resulting from free will are outweighed by the value of freedom itself. Second, some suffering serves educational and developmental purposes. Pain teaches us to avoid harmful behaviors. Hardship builds character and promotes moral growth. Challenges and obstacles give us opportunities to develop virtue through facing them courageously and wisely. A life without any difficulty would not promote human flourishing as effectively as life that includes manageable challenges. God permits suffering when it serves these beneficial purposes. Third, what appears evil from limited human perspective may serve good purposes in God's overall plan. We see only small fragments of the total pattern. God perceives all things at all times and understands how particular evils contribute to greater goods. Our suffering may benefit others or serve purposes we cannot now comprehend. Faith requires trusting that God's wisdom exceeds our understanding and that apparent evils fit into a benevolent overall design. Fourth, much natural evil results from the regular patterns God has established to make the world intelligible and navigable. Fire causes pain when we touch it because pain reliably signals danger. Disease and death result from biological patterns that also make life possible. God could intervene to prevent every particular evil, but this would undermine the systematic regularities that make natural science possible and practical life manageable. Occasional miracles are compatible with general regularity, but constant intervention would destroy the stable patterns we depend on. Fifth, suffering is inevitable in finite creatures. We are not God and cannot have all our desires satisfied immediately. Our finitude means limitations, vulnerabilities, frustrations. Some suffering is the natural consequence of being limited, dependent creatures rather than infinite, self-sufficient beings. God cannot create another God because that is logically impossible. Creating finite spirits necessarily means creating beings subject to limitations and their attendant pains. Berkeley also appeals to justice and afterlife. Temporal sufferings are brief compared to eternity. Those who suffer unjustly in this life may be compensated in the next. Those who cause unjust suffering will face divine justice. The present life is not the whole story. What seems unjust temporally may be resolved in eternal perspective. This does not eliminate present suffering, but provides hope that it is not meaningless or final. Yet Berkeley must acknowledge that these responses do not fully solve the problem of evil. Some suffering seems excessive and serves no apparent purpose. Innocent children suffer terribly. Natural disasters kill thousands. The distribution of suffering seems arbitrary and unfair. Berkeley's ultimate appeal is to faith in divine wisdom that exceeds human comprehension. We must trust that God knows what we cannot know, and that divine purposes are good even when we cannot understand them. This appeal to faith has satisfied some readers, but left others unconvinced. Critics argue that Berkeley's immaterialism actually makes the problem of evil worse by eliminating matter as an independent source of evil. Everything that happens is directly willed by God or permitted by God for reasons. This makes God more directly responsible for evil than in systems where matter has some independence. Berkeley would respond that materialism does not actually solve the problem because God still creates matter, and could prevent its harmful effects if willing to do so. The problem of animal suffering is particularly challenging. Animals feel pain but lack moral free will or capacity for moral development. What justifies their suffering? Berkeley might appeal to the overall balance of pleasure and pain in animal lives, or to animals serving human purposes. But these responses seem inadequate for extreme animal suffering. This remains a genuine difficulty for Berkeley's system, as for any theistic philosophy. Berkeley's treatment of evil reflects tensions in any attempt to reconcile belief in an all-good, all-powerful God with the reality of suffering. Immaterialism provides some distinctive resources, particularly the emphasis on finite freedom and divine purposes. But it also creates distinctive challenges by making God more directly the cause of all experiences. Berkeley's responses are thoughtful but not fully satisfying, leaving the problem of evil as an ongoing challenge for his philosophical theology. Part 13. Legacy and Influence. Berkeley died in 1753 in Oxford, where he had gone to supervise his son's education. His philosophical influence was complicated by widespread misunderstanding of his views. Many readers thought he denied the existence of the physical world or claimed that everything is mere illusion. This caricature made him seem absurd rather than profound. Samuel Johnson famously refuted Berkeley by kicking a stone, missing Berkeley's point entirely. Berkeley never denied that stones exist or that kicking them produces ideas of resistance. He only denied that stones are material substances rather than collections of ideas. His immediate influence was limited. Materialist philosophy continued to dominate despite Berkeley's criticisms. The success of Newtonian physics seemed to vindicate materialist assumptions about nature. Few philosophers accepted Berkeley's immaterialism, though many engaged seriously with his arguments. Hume read Berkeley carefully and developed empiricism further while rejecting immaterialism. Kant acknowledged Berkeley's importance while criticizing idealism generally. The Scottish common-sense philosophers, particularly Thomas Reid, saw Berkeley as representing the dangerous consequences of accepting Locke's theory of ideas. They argued that if we begin with ideas as immediate objects of perception, skepticism and idealism inevitably follow. Better to reject the theory of ideas entirely and insist on direct realism. This critique influenced later philosophy, but rested partly on misunderstanding Berkeley's actual views. In the 19th century, Berkeley gained new appreciation as idealism became more philosophically respectable. German idealists like Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel developed systems in which mind or spirit is fundamental to reality. While their systems differed dramatically from Berkeley's, they shared the basic commitment to idealism. Berkeley was recognized as an important precursor, even though his theistic empiricism differed from German rationalist idealism. The British idealists, particularly T.H. Green and F.H. Bradley, also drew inspiration from Berkeley while developing distinctive forms of absolute idealism. They rejected Berkeley's pluralism of individual finite spirits in favor of monistic conceptions of one absolute spirit. But they shared Berkeley's conviction that reality is fundamentally mental and that materialism is philosophically incoherent. Bradley's critique of relations and appearance echoes Berkeleyan themes while taking them in new directions. In the early 20th century, logical positivists and phenomenalists found resources in Berkeley. Phenomenalism, the view that physical objects are logical constructions from sense data, resembles Berkeley's claim that objects are collections of ideas. But phenomenalists typically rejected Berkeley's theological framework and sought to provide secular empiricist reconstructions of physical reality. Berkeley's arguments against material substance influenced these movements, even though his theological conclusions did not. A. J. Ayer and other logical positivists saw Berkeley as an early empiricist who rightly rejected metaphysical nonsense, but wrongly introduced God to solve problems that could be handled through logical analysis. They appropriated Berkeley's critique of material substance while rejecting his positive idealism. This selective appropriation reflects Berkeley's complex legacy. His arguments have influenced philosophers who reject his conclusions. G. E. Moore and Bertrand Russell attacked idealism in ways that affected Berkeley's reputation. Moore's defense of common sense against idealism targeted different forms of idealism than Berkeley's, but created a climate hostile to all idealist philosophies. Russell's logical atomism and sense-data theory engaged with Berkeleyan themes while reaching different conclusions. The dominance of analytic philosophy through much of the 20th century meant Berkeley was read more as a historical figure than as a live option. Yet Berkeley remained philosophically relevant. His arguments against abstraction influenced nominalist movements. His philosophy of mathematics anticipated formalist and constructivist approaches. His critique of infinitesimals was vindicated by later developments in analysis. His theory of vision influenced psychology and cognitive science. His philosophy of science contributed to instrumentalist and anti-realist interpretations of scientific theories. Late 20th century philosophy saw renewed interest in Berkeley. Philosophers of mind engaged with his arguments about the relationship between mind and matter. The hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experience arises from physical processes, echoes concerns Berkeley raised about the intelligibility of matter causing ideas. While few embrace Berkeley's immaterialism, many find his arguments relevant to ongoing debates. Phenomenology, particularly in Maurice Merleau-Ponty's work, engages with Berkeleyan themes about perception and embodiment. The claim that perception is active interpretation rather than passive reception echoes Berkeley's theory of vision. The emphasis on lived experience over abstract theorizing parallels Berkeley's critique of philosophical abstraction. These connections show Berkeley's continuing relevance beyond narrow historical classification. Contemporary philosophy of religion finds resources in Berkeley for defending theism against materialism. His arguments that order in nature points to divine intelligence, that consciousness cannot be explained by matter, that objective morality requires God, continue to influence natural theology. While specific arguments have been refined and modified, the basic Berkeleyan strategy of using epistemological and metaphysical arguments to defend religious belief remains influential. Berkeley's legacy is complex and multifaceted. He is remembered as one of the great British empiricists alongside Locke and Hume, though his idealism sets him apart from their materialism and skepticism. He is recognized as an important critic of abstraction, infinity, and infinitesimals in mathematics. He is acknowledged as a pioneer in philosophy of perception and psychology of vision. He is studied as a sophisticated defender of theistic philosophy, and he remains a challenging thinker whose arguments continue to provoke debate and reflection. Part 14. Berkeley in the Digital Age. We live in an age that makes Berkeley's philosophy newly relevant. Virtual reality creates convincing perceptual experiences without corresponding material objects. Digital existence challenges traditional assumptions about physical reality. Simulation hypothesis suggests our entire world might be a computer simulation. These contemporary developments make Berkeley's claim that reality is fundamentally mental seem less absurd than it did to earlier generations. Consider virtual reality technology. When you wear a VR headset, you perceive a detailed three-dimensional environment. You see objects, hear sounds, feel haptic feedback. Yet there are no material objects corresponding to your perceptions. The perceived world exists only as patterns of data processed by computers and presented to your senses. This seems precisely analogous to Berkeley's claim that the physical world consists of ideas presented to minds, rather than material substances existing independently. Phenomenology, particularly in Maurice Merleau-Ponty's work, engages with Berkeleyan themes about perception and embodiment. The claim that perception is active interpretation rather than passive reception echoes Berkeley's theory of vision. The emphasis on lived experience over abstract theorizing parallels Berkeley's critique of philosophical abstraction. These connections show Berkeley's continuing relevance beyond narrow historical classification. Contemporary philosophy of religion finds resources in Berkeley for defending theism against materialism. His arguments that order in nature points to divine intelligence, that consciousness cannot be explained by matter, that objective morality requires God, continue to influence natural theology. While specific arguments have been refined and modified, the basic Berkeleyan strategy of using epistemological and metaphysical arguments to defend religious belief remains influential. Berkeley's legacy is complex and multifaceted. He is remembered as one of the great British empiricists alongside Locke and Hume, though his idealism sets him apart from their materialism and skepticism. He is recognized as an important critic of abstraction, infinity, and infinitesimals in mathematics. He is acknowledged as a pioneer in philosophy of perception and psychology of vision. He is studied as a sophisticated defender of theistic philosophy, and he remains a challenging thinker whose arguments continue to provoke debate and reflection. Part 14. Berkeley. In the digital age. We live in an age that makes Berkeley's philosophy newly relevant. Virtual reality creates convincing perceptual experiences without corresponding material objects. Digital existence challenges traditional assumptions about physical reality. Simulation hypothesis suggests our entire world might be a computer simulation. These contemporary developments make Berkeley's claim that reality is fundamentally mental seem less absurd than it did to earlier generations. Consider virtual reality technology. When you wear a VR headset, you perceive a detailed three-dimensional environment. You see objects, hear sounds, feel haptic feedback. Yet there are no material objects corresponding to your perceptions. The perceived world exists only as patterns of data processed by computers and presented to your senses. This seems precisely analogous to Berkeley's claim that the physical world consists of ideas presented to minds rather than material substances existing independently. The simulation hypothesis, popularized by philosopher Nick Bostrom, suggests that we might be living in a computer simulation created by advanced beings. If true, physical reality as we experience it would be computational rather than material. The laws of nature would be programming rules. Objects would be data structures. This is remarkably similar to Berkeley's view that reality consists of ideas in minds, following rules established by God. Substitute simulation for divine mind, and the parallel is striking. Video games provide another analogy. When playing a game, characters and objects exist only as data. The game world persists whether you play or not, because data remains stored even when not actively rendered. When you return to the game, the world is as you left it. This resembles Berkeley's solution to continuous existence. Physical objects persist because ideas persist in God's mind, even when not perceived by finite minds. The game persists because data persists even when not rendered on any screen. Digital existence also challenges materialist metaphysics. Increasing amounts of human activity occur in digital spaces. We work remotely through screens. We socialize online. We consume media digitally. We conduct financial transactions without physical currency. We form relationships with people we never meet physically. If the digital realm is not material, what is it? It seems to be patterns of information, ideas encoded and transmitted electronically. Berkeley would say this shows that ideas can constitute robust realities without material substrata. The internet itself is fundamentally informational rather than material. Yes, it requires physical hardware servers, cables, computers. But the internet as we experience it is not identical to this hardware. The internet is patterns of data transmitted through hardware, ideas expressed in electronic form. Multiple physical implementations could instantiate the same information. This suggests that information, ideas, is more fundamental than the material substrate, exactly as Berkeley claimed. Artificial intelligence raises questions about consciousness and minds that Berkeley addressed. Can machines think? Can silicon-based systems have subjective experiences? Materialists who identify mind with brain face challenges explaining why biological neurons should generate consciousness, while artificial neural networks do not. Berkeley's framework might actually have advantages here. Consciousness is not produced by material substrata, but is fundamental. Whether biological or silicon, systems exhibit consciousness depends on whether spirits are associated with them, not on material properties. Social media creates realities that are neither purely subjective nor purely objective in traditional senses. A trending topic exists only because many people perceive and discuss it. It has no material existence beyond patterns in human attention and digital data. Yet it is real and can have significant effects. Berkeley's framework, where realities consist of ideas in minds coordinated by patterns, makes sense of these phenomena. Social realities are collections of ideas following rules, neither material substances nor mere illusions. Cryptocurrency and blockchain technology create value and ownership through distributed digital consensus rather than material backing. Bitcoin exists only as data structures validated by network participants. Yet it has real value and can be owned and transferred. This exemplifies Berkeley's point that value and reality do not require material substances. Patterns of ideas coordinated systematically can constitute genuine realities with real effects. The increasing prevalence of remote work and digital communication challenges the importance of physical presence. People collaborate effectively without occupying the same material space. Relationships form and flourish through digital interaction. This suggests that what matters is not shared material location, but coordinated experiences and shared ideas. Berkeley would say this vindicates his view that spatial relations are about ordering of ideas rather than properties of material space. Medical technology also creates Berkeleyan scenarios. Prosthetics controlled by brain signals. Virtual reality therapy for psychological conditions. Medications that alter perception and experience. These interventions change subjective experience without necessarily changing material brain states in simple ways. The effectiveness of such technologies suggests that experience itself, not material substrata, is what matters for many purposes. Berkeley's focus on ideas rather than matter seems justified. The hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved by materialist philosophy. How do subjective experiences arise from objective, physical processes? Why is there something it is like to be conscious rather than mere information processing without experience? Berkeley's approach sidesteps these problems by denying that consciousness arises from matter. Consciousness is fundamental, and apparent material processes are really patterns in ideas. This may not be the correct answer, but it is an answer, unlike materialist approaches that still lack explanations. Environmental concerns also connect to Berkeleyan themes. If we recognize our deep interconnection with natural systems, if we understand that we are participants in ecological patterns rather than external observers, we move towards something like Berkeley's view of reality as systematic coordination of experiences, rather than separate material substances mechanically interacting. Ecological thinking is fundamentally holistic and relational, closer to Berkeley's idealism than to materialist atomism. Part 15. The enduring questions. Berkeley's philosophy endures because it addresses permanent questions about the nature of reality and our place within it. The relationship between mind and matter, the foundations of knowledge, the existence of God, the nature of causation, the status of mathematics. These are not problems that can be finally solved and set aside. Each generation must grapple with them anew in light of contemporary circumstances and knowledge. What is matter? This question remains live despite centuries of scientific progress. Physics has revealed that matter is very different from common sense supposes. Solid objects are mostly empty space with patterns of quantum fields. Particles are not tiny solid things but probability distributions in multi-dimensional spaces. Matter and energy convert into each other according to Einstein's equation. The more we learn about matter, the less material it seems. Berkeley's claim that matter is unintelligible becomes more plausible as physics reveals stranger and stranger features of the supposedly physical world. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics creates interpretive challenges that connect to Berkeley's philosophy. Why does observation affect quantum states? Some interpretations invoke consciousness as playing a fundamental role in determining physical reality. While this is controversial and probably not what Berkeley meant, it shows that the relationship between mind and physical reality remains mysterious and contested. We have not definitively refuted Berkeley's claim that physical reality depends on minds. The fine-tuning of physical constants for life has revived natural theology arguments resembling Berkeley's. Why do fundamental constants have the precise values necessary for complex structures and life to exist? Some appeal to divine design, others invoke multiverse theories. But the question echoes Berkeley's argument that the order and regularity of nature points to intelligent design. Whether Berkeley's specific argument succeeds or not, the underlying question remains relevant. Consciousness studies have not yet explained how subjective experience arises from physical processes. The explanatory gap between third-person physical descriptions and first-person subjective experience remains. Some philosophers argue that consciousness is irreducible and must be taken as fundamental rather than explained in materialist terms. This does not vindicate Berkeley's full system, but it suggests that mind may be more fundamental than materialism allows. The nature of mathematical objects continues to divide philosophers. Are numbers and geometric forms abstract objects existing independently of minds? Are they mental constructions? Are they properties of material reality? Berkeley's nominalism and psychologism about mathematics remain minority views, but the questions he raised have not been definitively answered. Mathematical philosophy still grapples with issues Berkeley identified. The foundations of ethics remain contested. Does morality require God? Can objective values exist without divine foundations? Berkeley's theological ethics has both defenders and critics. Secular ethics has made sophisticated developments, but questions about objectivity and motivation persist. Berkeley's integration of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics provides one model for systematic philosophy even if specific conclusions are rejected. The problem of skepticism continues to challenge philosophers. How do we know our perceptions correspond to reality? Berkeley's solution through immaterialism is not widely accepted, but the problem he addressed remains. Contemporary epistemology still seeks to explain how knowledge is possible, given the apparent gap between mind and world. Berkeley's attempt to close that gap by identifying world with ideas remains a provocative option. The role of perception in constituting reality is explored in contemporary philosophy through direct realism, representationalism, and various other theories. Berkeley's claim that we perceive ideas rather than material objects directly influences these debates. While few accept Berkeley's full idealism, his arguments shape how philosophers think about perception and its objects. The question of what we immediately perceive is still Berkeley's question. The relationship between scientific theories and reality raises questions Berkeley addressed. Are scientific theories literally true descriptions of mind-independent reality? Or are they useful instruments for predicting observations? Instrumentalist and anti-realist interpretations of science echo Berkeleyan themes, viewing science as about patterns in experience rather than hidden material substrata. Scientific realism versus anti-realism debates continue Berkeley's interrogation of matter. Virtual reality and digital existence create new contexts for Berkeley's questions. What constitutes reality? What distinguishes real from simulated experiences? If sophisticated simulations are indistinguishable from physical reality, does the distinction matter? These contemporary questions recapitulate Berkeley's challenges to materialist metaphysics in new forms. His philosophy provides resources for thinking about virtual realities and digital existence. The meaning of existence itself remains philosophically perplexing. Berkeley's claim that to be is to be perceived challenges the default materialist assumption that existence is fundamentally independent of minds. What does it mean for something to exist? Must existence be possible object of experience? Or can things exist that could never be experienced? These questions about the nature of being itself remain as relevant as when Berkeley asked them. Berkeley's philosophy endures not because he provided final answers, but because he asked the right questions and pursued them with clarity, rigor, and originality. He showed that common-sense assumptions about matter are philosophically questionable. He demonstrated that idealism can be systematic and coherent. He revealed connections between metaphysics, epistemology, mathematics, and theology. He challenged us to think carefully about what we mean by reality and existence. These contributions remain valuable regardless of whether we accept his conclusions. Conclusion. The mind of God. George Berkeley stands as one of philosophy's most radical thinkers, willing to question the most basic assumptions about reality. 3 centuries after his death, his arguments remain challenging and provocative. This is not because he solved philosophical problems that later thinkers forgot, but because he identified deep tensions in how we think about mind, matter, and their relationship. Material substance, abstract ideas, infinitesimals, mind-independent existence, these concepts that seem obvious and necessary to common sense, prove difficult to justify under philosophical scrutiny. What makes Berkeley eternally relevant is his refusal to accept comfortable contradictions or explanations that explain nothing. Philosophers say material substance exists beneath sensible qualities. But what is this substance? Something we know not what. They say ideas represent material objects, but how can we know representations match reality? We cannot step outside our ideas to compare. They say matter causes ideas in minds, but how can inert extended substance produce thought? No answer is given. Berkeley exposes these problems ruthlessly and offers bold solutions. Yet Berkeley also shows that denying matter need not lead to skepticism or unreality. The physical world is perfectly real as ideas in minds. Tables and trees genuinely exist with all their sensible qualities. Knowledge is possible because we perceive reality directly rather than through representations. Science discovers objective patterns because God produces ideas according to systematic rules. Moral truth exists because God is good and has ordered reality to promote our welfare. Immaterialism provides foundations for common sense, science, and ethics that materialism cannot match. The image of reality as divine language remains Berkeley's most powerful contribution. The regularities we observe in nature are not mechanical necessities imposed by material properties, but consistent patterns through which God communicates with finite spirits. Learning to understand nature is like learning to read God's grammar. Natural science is advanced linguistic competence, discovering subtle rules governing the divine language. This preserves the objectivity and usefulness of science while grounding it in divine wisdom rather than blind mechanism. We are ideas in the mind of God, not arbitrary or chaotic ideas, but systematic patterns that God maintains according to wise and benevolent purposes. Our perceptions are what God chooses to present to us, coordinated with perceptions of other finite spirits to create a shared world. Our actions are genuine exercises of freedom, not determined by material causes, though God knows how we will choose and coordinates consequences systematically. We are participants in divine purposes, finite spirits relating to the infinite spirit that constitutes and sustains all reality. This is not a depressing vision, but a liberating one. We are not isolated consciousness trapped in material bodies, cut off from reality and other minds. We are spirits in direct contact with reality because reality is mental. We commune with God constantly through sensory perception. We connect with other spirits through the systematic coordination of our experiences. The apparent gap between mind and world dissolves when we recognize that the world is mind, that existence is perception, that reality is fundamentally spiritual. Berkeley teaches us to question assumptions and follow arguments where they lead, regardless of how counterintuitive the conclusions seem. Material substance seems obviously real, but careful analysis reveals it is unintelligible. Abstract ideas seem necessary for thought, but honest introspection shows we never actually have them. Mind-independent existence seems meaningful, but examination proves we cannot form coherent ideas of it. Philosophy requires intellectual courage to reject familiar errors in favor of unfamiliar truths. Living according to this understanding requires accepting our nature as dependent spirits whose existence and experience depend continuously on God. It requires gratitude for the systematic world God provides and the mental capacities that allow us to understand it. It requires humility about our limitations while celebrating the extraordinary fact that finite minds can perceive divine purposes. It requires moral seriousness because our free choices matter and have eternal consequences. It requires faith that God's wisdom exceeds our understanding and that apparent evils serve purposes we cannot fully grasp. The physical world continues existing. Ideas continue appearing in regular patterns. God continues sustaining all things in being. These truths that Berkeley perceived in 18th century Ireland remain true today. They will remain true as long as there are finite spirits capable of perceiving them. The fundamental structure of reality does not change with scientific progress or technological development. New discoveries reveal more about how God has ordered ideas, but they do not change the fact that reality is fundamentally mental, that existence is perception, that all things subsist in the divine mind. In the end, Berkeley offers us not a system of doctrines to memorize, but a way of seeing to cultivate. He teaches us to look beneath material appearances to mental reality, to recognize that everything we know and care about consists of ideas in minds, to see God's purposes in natural regularities, to understand ourselves as spiritual beings rather than material objects, to appreciate the systematic coordination that makes shared experience and knowledge possible, to find meaning and value in participating in divine purposes rather than in accumulating material possessions or pursuing fleeting pleasures. The mind of God encompasses all reality. We are thoughts in that infinite mind, temporary but real, limited but significant, dependent but free. Our perceptions are God sharing divine ideas with us. Our understanding is God enabling us to recognize patterns in those ideas. Our freedom is God granting us genuine agency within the systematic framework of natural law. Our existence is God willing us to be and sustaining us in being from moment to moment. This is enough. This must be enough. This is what it means to exist as finite spirits in a world of ideas. Berkeley understood this 300 years ago. We are still learning what he tried to teach. Perhaps we will never fully grasp it because our finite minds cannot comprehend infinite wisdom. But the attempt itself is worthwhile. The journey toward understanding is part of how we fulfill our nature as rational spirits seeking truth. To be is to be perceived. This simple formula contains infinite depth. We exist because God perceives us. The world exists because God perceives it and allows us to perceive portions of divine ideas. Knowledge is possible because perception is direct rather than mediated. Reality is mental rather than material. Spirit rather than substance. Ideas rather than atoms. Mind rather than matter. Berkeley saw clearly what others missed or denied. Reality is not what it seems to common sense or to materialist philosophy. It is stranger, richer, more unified, more mental than we ordinarily think. But it is also more knowable, more meaningful, more directly accessible than materialism allows. We are not isolated intellects imprisoned in flesh, observing a material world from outside. We are spirits participating in divine consciousness, perceiving reality itself, connected to all other minds through the infinite mind that encompasses all. The eternal mind perceives eternally. We are its temporary perceptions, burning briefly but intensely, experiencing fragments of infinite reality before returning to whatever existence God ordains for spirits beyond this life. This is not depressing, but appropriate for beings like us. We cannot be God. We can only be what we are, finite, dependent, limited, yet capable of understanding, freedom, virtue, and communion with the infinite. This is Berkeley's gift to philosophy and to humanity. The recognition that mind is fundamental, that ideas constitute reality, that God is not remote but intimately present in every perception, that we are spiritual beings whose true home is not material space, but the divine mind itself. Whether we accept these conclusions or not, we must grapple with the questions Berkeley raised and the arguments he provided. Philosophy cannot ignore Berkeley without impoverishing itself. His voice remains one we must hear, even if ultimately we choose different answers to the questions he posed so brilliantly.